Hi there, welcome. We're talking DFARS and CMMC compliance today. So IronEdge Group team, we have myself and Branson Braid with you today, and we're gonna be going over high level of what DFARS and CMMC is all about. I know there's a lot of questions and a lot of new items that are coming up, especially with CMMC going into effect over the next few years. So hopefully we're going to kind of clear some of the smoke in the air and give you guys some insight on what it means at a high level. So really what we're going to do is do some quick introductions. My name is Patrick Maese. I am with IronEdge, I think about 11 years now, maybe 12 years.
Wow.
It's been a long time. And I'm a vice president here in San Antonio, Texas. And I oversee a lot of our larger accounts, as well as in the past couple of years, a lot of the security stuff, especially in the realm of the Department of Defense industrial base with CMMC and DFARS and a lot of the security programs that go along with that. And so also on the meeting today, we have Branson Braid. Branson, you want to give us a quick introduction on your end?
Of course. I'm Branson Braid. I'm a systems engineer here at IronEdge Group. I've been here a little bit over 5 years. Time's gone as I've been part of the projects team as well. Recently really engaged within the sales cycle. So allowing me to see clients from the beginning of their inception with us all the way through to implementation of a lot of these security practices of really how they mature their organizations over time. So I'm really excited to really dive into how compliance has trickled down from the DFARS and CMMC levels into regular organizations. So talking about how this has matured over time is really going to be an interesting discussion today.
Right. And Branson and I have been working hand in hand on a lot of the DFARS stuff in the past year or so. And so we've gotten smart together and have a lot of experience with regards to how it trickles down into the environments. It's an interesting segue to kind of talk about the difference between DFARS and CMMC. In the grand spectrum of things, from a security perspective, the Department of Defense's attempt to secure really what's called CUI in the environment, which is controlled unclassified information. And CUI can run a gamut of different categories. In fact, they publish the categories on their websites of what can be included as CUI. And it's typically going to be anything that's going to be engineering docs. It could be contractual information. It could be personal information, PII information. It has a whole range of different types of categories. And that's really the crux of what all of this regulation is trying to protect. If you look at different industries, such as the medical industry that has the HIPAA regulations, you have the credit card industry that has the PCI regulations, really anything that has this sort of governance is really going to be about protecting a certain type of data. So for example, retail, they want to protect the credit card information. Well, in the medical industry, they want to protect, sensitive medical personal PII information. Exactly. Yeah. And in the DoD space, in the government space, they're really kind of protecting anything that might be sensitive and not really not supposed to be publicly available or accessible. And so really when you think about this type of information, what they're doing is they're building up a wall of security around protecting this information, whether that's being transmitted or stored or handled or processed. Really anything that's that may come in contact, whether that's a person or a piece of technology, is all about protecting that type of data. And so really what we've seen in the past 12 to 24 months is really a lot of organizations just trying to struggle to understand, do they have this type of CUI information in their environment? And that's really going to be the qualifier to determine where you sit with regards to that level of governance, right? In some cases, organizations unequivocally do not have CUI information and they're just dealing with contract information. Then that's a much lower level of security and regulation that you need to be applied on it.
Very much
That's
so.
specifically called FCI, and that may be a level 1 type of compliance for CMMC. And it's certainly a lot less restrictive than, say, a level 3, which is if you have CUI in your environment, you are automatically a level 3. So the
Yes.
question comes up is, what is CUI and how do I find that out? And that's really going to be, conversations with stakeholders and looking at your contracts, because contracts will have flow through requirements that say, look, generally in having business with either a prime or in the contract, it'll say you have, you may be dealing with this information. So it's assumed that you have this information on that contract. And for that reason, you have that same level of regulation as if you were a direct DoD contractor that's dealing with that information. So I got a little bit in the weeds. I want to take a step back on kind of the differences between DFARS and CMMC. DFARS has been around really since 2013, and really it was a step in the direction of trying to uniformly control a lot of the various differences of types of secured information. So that could be, ITAR information or controlled information, stuff that's been around for 20 or 30 years. But really what's happened is there's been a lot of different standards and different types of, control mechanisms on top of different various documents. And there really hasn't been a standardized way of identifying what this is. And so DFARS was implemented in 2013 as a way to standardize that. It makes it so that, if it is a controlled unclassified information, CUI information, really anybody that's creating it or managing it should have standards with regards to making sure that the documents are labeled as such. It has the right heading information and tells you how it's controlled. And that was a step into making sure that everything is being handled in some capacity.
So the provision of clear guidelines in that regard. Exactly.
And so what's happened in the DFARS is, okay, we have this standardized way of labeling information, and they want to wrap the security around it on how to tell organizations how to protect that information. And so really what happened in the past, 8 to 10 years is they gave out all of these rules, these controls on how to protect this information. And that's part of the NIST 800-171 controls. It's 110 different controls. And they said, okay, here's what you need to do. And you need to have a plan on how you're going to address this. And what's happened was there was really not a lot of teeth to it, right? There wasn't a lot of enforcement on making sure that the industrial base is actually doing that. So what they found was a lot of the times, a lot of these companies said, okay, we're going to get to it, but they never actually did. And so for, the better part of the last 7 years, they really didn't get a lot of forward motion in getting these organizations to protect this information. And so they made the decision to shift into an enforcement mode, which is the CMMC process, right? And so as of November 30th of last year, there's this interim rule that says, okay, if your company is not going to take it upon themselves to address all these controls, then we're going to force you. We're going to make sure that you're doing that and that you're going to be certified. And moving forward, it's going to be a requirement in order for you to be awarded a contract. So the interim rule that went into effect on November 30th basically stated, you guys need to do a self-assessment. You need to look at your organization. You need to see where you stand within all of these 110 controls and go through them and say, am I doing this? Am I not doing this? Does this not apply? And through that self-assessment, what you end up coming out with is a score. That score then is required to be uploaded to a government website. It's called the SPRS directory. And it's really a method for contractors and people that are going out to the defense industry base and seeing how, just from a quick snapshot, where you are from a maturity standpoint in that assessment, right? So if I'm a prime contractor and I want to go out and get a sub to help me out on this contract, what I'll do is I'll go to this directory and see 10 or 15 subs that are out there and say, okay, well, here's 15 potential candidates that I want to do an RFP for. These 10 have a really good score, and these 5 are kind of ranked low. From my perspective, I would want to go with somebody that is more mature from a security perspective, right? So it's a quick look to see, where you sit on from a level of maturity from the security standpoint. And that's really the goal of this interim rule, is to get your scores in, get it into a directory so that you can at least know that you have a starting point and you have a plan to get to a level of compliance. And so CMMC is really a shift from making it your responsibility to making it a requirement, right? And so DFARS and CMMC share a lot of the same requirements. In fact, they all have a foundational requirement of this NIST 800-171 controls, these 110 controls. They both have the same requirements. The only difference is CMMC has, for level 3, has an additional 20 controls, right? So really what we recommend is, if you're really starting from scratch or you're starting from ground zero, these 800-171 controls are really what you should be focused on addressing and attacking, right?
Yeah, they're good.
I'm going to pause here and let Branson kind of chime in on some stuff here.
Well, they're good foundational blocks. You're right. With the DFARS, set of 110 controls, CMMC really shifts the accountability back to the primes and the flow downs of being responsible for their security. DFARS, yes, puts it in place, but CMMC really puts that accountability back on them to say, let's go ahead and complete that assessment. And it's interesting when we talk about not just DFARS, but all the trickle down from different levels of compliancy, they all require some level of assessment with the provision of a POAM, or plan of action and milestones. And like you said, that really sets the roadmap for where do you need to go for the level of maturity that your organization needs to achieve. For some people, that's just PCI, and that's segmenting certain levels of their network. At the DFARS and CMMC level, those controls really set the stage for how you're looking at the processes and procedures of your organization. So really implementing both of these, but starting with DFARS and understanding, how am I going to get ready for CMMC, and how am I going to go forward with all of these controls? Instead, take a step back and look at DFARS and say, what are these 110 controls really asking me? How do I get started with this? How do I build a POAM? And then when do I need to really start looking at submitting that SPRS score? Yeah,
and that's a great point. By doing the assessment, you know kind of where you are and how far you need to go, right? So if you do an assessment and you find your score is on the lower side, or the lower end of the spectrum, then you'll need to do a lot of work, and that may take months, if not years, right? And so at least understanding where you sit in that scoring process will kind of give you an idea how long it'll take you to get out of that, to get to a compliance point.
I think it's understanding that's the right first step. Really understanding how deep the water is, how deep the water or the mud is, depending on the organization and what maturity level you're trying to achieve, level 1 versus level 3.
So CMMC is a phased in requirement. What you're going to start seeing is contracts start to trickle out over the next 5 years, where they're going to start requiring you, in order for you to bid for these contracts, you're going to have to meet and be certified that you're doing all of the controls, the NIST 110 controls plus the 20 additional CMMC controls. And really, in order for you to be awarded this contract in the future, you have to have an auditor come in, verify that you're doing all of these and get certified. And that certification is good for 3 years. But regardless, you need to be certified in order for you to be awarded. And again, this is a phased in approach. Contracts are going to start having this language over the next 4 years up until 2025, when everything is going to be a requirement. So that's really, at this point, if you're starting from ground zero, you really need to kind of get on the ball to start this process, because it's likely going to be a multi-year initiative to get to a point where you're certified and you get that stamp of approval and you can start being awarded these contracts. And certainly if you can get to that finish line sooner, then you are going to be in a lot better spot to beat the competition, essentially. So I'm gonna go to the next slide here. So like I was saying, CMMC is certainly a now issue, and it's also a future issue because it's a phased in approach. But if certainly we're not getting started at this point, it's critical that we start that process, start reviewing your environment, and then creating this plan of action and how you're going to reach that compliancy. And so really to kind of give you some insight on what those 110 controls are within NIST, it varies based on access control, like physical security into your environment, training and awareness, configurations that you'll need to do within your environment, a lot of policies that need to be generated. That's oftentimes the first step in this process, is working with your departments, working with your operations teams, trying to build policies that can be applied to all of your training materials. And that is a process that involves everything from operations to HR, all departments. It's a bit of a misnomer to think that IT is responsible for security. It's a shift. It's a paradigm shift in thinking where it's more of an organizational programmatic approach of understanding that everyone needs to play their role into pushing this forward. It can't be just an IT person, because they don't have the requisite skills necessary to really build a lot of these requirements that are affecting the entire organization and how you run your business and how your employees work and the training that they receive. So there is a lot of technical requirements in these regulations, but there is also a lot of stuff that's beyond just the technical stuff, and that's important to drive home.
Yeah, I think it's very important to stress the fact that there are a number of different stakeholders that have to be involved in that conversation of actually understanding not just network and system boundaries, but what businesses actually do and sell, how they make money, and how that interacts with their requirements for compliancy within DFARS and CMMC. Understanding whether or not you're doing something that is a COTS product and straight off the shelf, not making any modifications to that, or if you're doing something that's very custom, direct for the client, that works within that space, and you're going to be heavily required of level 3 flow down requirements that sometimes even require that your prime can look at your system. So understanding and preparing for the level of compliancy that you have to adhere to based on what you do as a business is really important. And these controls help to build an understanding of that. Mm-hmm. Where do I lie? Where do I fit? And what do I actually have to do to be successful in reaching the level of compliancy for CMMC?
Yeah, and it's important. You touched upon system boundaries, and a lot of questions that we receive is, what do I need to protect? Is it just my ERP system? Is it just my email system? And that's part of the process of doing this assessment, is following those breadcrumbs, right? Oftentimes, someone will say, I just want to protect my ERP system because that's where I may store my CUI information. Well, in all honesty, how does that data get there? Right. And it could come from an email, and it, people grab it from there and work on it on their workstations, or it's transferred to different locations. And so following those breadcrumbs across all of your different, information systems or technologies, that's all part of the system boundary. That's all part of what you would need to protect. So it's not just a specific information system, but it's anything that touches it, right? Or anybody that accesses it, and the workstations that they access it from, or the locations they access it from. It's not always going to be in your office. It's going to be, especially in the world of COVID, people working from home, which opens up a whole other realm of security requirements, because you have to have that same level of physical control and protection of those environments and those systems. So all of that is within the system boundaries, especially if that information is being moved around and within your network, or printers for that matter. If you're printing any sort of like engineering documents or mechanical designs, all of that
fall under CUI. All of it falls within scope.
Exactly. So really wrapping your head around, where this information lives, how it's moving around your network, that helps you understand how you protect all that information. And it may be that you start looking at things and say, okay, well, it's all over the place. How do I control that and keep it, in a certain part of your environment, which the government likes to call an enclave, right? That's where you're kind of carving up maybe a certain department where you have specific employees and specific systems that are only required to be managing this type of information. And that helps you laser focus your security controls on that department, on those operations, on those systems. And it helps because there's such a high level of regulation. You wouldn't necessarily need to apply it over your entire organization, but maybe just a subcomponent or a department of your organization. And that way you can focus on doing all the security controls on just maybe a small subset of that.
Yeah, and while it may be a greenfield solution, with some of the products that we'll talk about that kind of have to go into that solution for an enclave, it does become very cost efficient compared to trying to assimilate all of those security practices to your full organization when all of your employees don't need that level of compliance.
The last one we want to touch on is Microsoft 365. Oftentimes we see a lot of misconceptions on Office 365 because really a lot of organizations are adopting that, and we always recommend it simply because it's a great solution, it's a great cloud solution. But what we want to make clear is there are different products that Microsoft provides out to the commercial space, right? They have a commercial tendency and they have a government tendency. And what's important to know is that your traditional Office 365 services that they sell to most commercial is not capable of meeting the requirements that both DFARS and CMMC require. They've specifically built out a government tendency, either called GCC or GCC High, that is specially built to meet certifications and accreditations for the U.S. public sector customers. Specifically, there's requirements that you need to have your data stored in the U.S., that it's not stored in anywhere outside the U.S., like China or Russia or someplace like that. So that's a critical component. We also have the abilities to make sure that Microsoft's personnel are properly screened to manage that environment. So that's a critical component. So that's one of them. And then finally is a lot of the log retention within DFARS specifically is if there is a breach, the DoD in the DFARS requirement states that you need to have at least 90 days worth of your logs and images that they can come audit and come ask for information so that they can do their due diligence. And really the commercial environment doesn't provide that. They don't store that sort of information that they could just hand over to you or to the government, because it's not built in that way. So it's important to know that those specific requirements have in the government tenancy, they do those things, but in the commercial tenancy, they don't. So that's why if you have a lot of your email or your files in the commercial environment, you're not going to be able to use that and meet compliancy down the road. The only thing that's in the commercial tenancy that would work is if you were CMMC level 1. That would allow you to meet compliancy because it's just FCI information that you're protecting, or the Azure environment. So Microsoft's commercial Azure environment, which would have servers and that sort of thing in that instance, they've recently been approved to be compliant, right? So, but if you're using the traditional Office 365 products like SharePoint or email, that sort of thing in the commercial in tenancy, it's worth noting that it's not going to be compliant for CMMC or DFARS. And so what happens is oftentimes you'll go out and we'll recommend customers move all of their data from the commercial environment to the government tenancy, so that it's a first step in getting to that point. Because Microsoft has been building a lot of products that check those boxes for certification and accreditation. Everything from their SIM, which is Sentinel, to a lot of the security tools and everything else that these regulations require. Microsoft has been working hard to make sure that their product stack covers a lot, if not most, of those requirements. Now, there's going to be some stuff like awareness training that Microsoft simply doesn't provide, but regardless, Microsoft's solution stack is pretty healthy with regards to how many of the check marks they're able to check through the compliance part of their product stack.
Patrick, I want to bring up one point. One thing that we talk about often are what we consider swivel chair employees within organizations, people that work on both sides of the fence when it comes to regular org charts versus compliant and DFARS compliant org parts of their organization. Sometimes we have people that want to have 2 different email addresses, or just have one email address that's in GCC high and keep my information in the regular tenancy and just operate out of there. Is there any problem with having both of those spaces available to certain employees?
Yeah, so that poses an interesting problem, right? So oftentimes what we'll see is companies that aren't 100% government contracts, right? They may only have like a small section of their organization, maybe like 5 or 10% of their organizational contracts are within this space, right? And so you have this issue where you have a certain number of employees. Let's say it's a small company and you have 20 employees. And only 15 or 20% of your revenue is actually within the government space. How do you go about, if the majority of your business is not required to have this high level of security? How do you go about creating a solution where you do have an enclave, maybe a small section that meets these regulations? But you need to have an employee that works between the two operations, right? And it can get super complicated. I think there's not really an easy button. If I were to say that the closest thing there is to an easy button may be Windows Virtual Desktop, because the way that works is you're building all of your government operational stuff in an environment where you can secure that environment a little easier than it would be to having to rip out all of your networking, all your servers, replace all your workstations for, 80% of your organization that has nothing to do with, these government contracts. So looking at a solution like a virtual desktop environment can make a lot of sense. It certainly isn't the cheapest solution, but when you look at the pros and cons of a solution like that, where you weigh the fact that if your corporate network and all your systems are now within scope and we have to secure everything, it may be more expensive to retrofit your entire organization than it would be to just kind of build out a few workstations in the cloud environment and just build your fortress up in the cloud. So that would be something as part of a plan of action or POAM is like, okay, does this make sense for our organization? What does that cost look like? What is the operational value of that? And those are the things that you would weigh with regards to your remediation steps.
Yes.
There's a lot of positives to it, but it's certainly one of many paths to becoming compliant. But for the purposes of swivel chairs and people that work between two different operations and two different types of contracts, commercial and government, there's a lot of positive things about potentially rolling out a virtual desktop environment.
Okay. I just think about that from a long-term perspective. Mm-hmm. How do we plan for these things? I know we continue to speak about the POAM, but the POAM is really integral in understanding that this is not an overnight change of any sort. This is a long approach that we consider it a program, looking at it from different steps, procedures. We always say you can throw as much hardware as you want at something, but unless you have the correct procedures and policies to govern the administration of those systems, then it's all for none. So with DFARS really coming in and saying, hey, CMMC requirement is going to put the requirement back on you as a client to get these things done and keep yourself protected so that you can continue to do work with us. It is a really important roadmap to provide people to say you have a number of years to start doing this, but where it starts is your assessment. So I think looking at all these different pieces is really important to the full picture of what it looks like to get there.
Yeah, and that's something worth driving home. And I'll go to the last, kind of our closing remarks here is that that POAM, what you'll find if you haven't already performed your assessment and created your plan of action, is that it's going to take dedicated time, dedicated resources to really get any of this done. And it's a program. It's a security program. It's not security technology. It's not something that you would just drop in place and walk away from. It's definitely something that requires new sets of resources, whether that's carving out time within your day to dedicate to this as a CIO, CTO, IT administrator, or even some of the C-suite and stakeholders. It requires the entire organization to get on board and push forward. And so really it's understanding that you do need to dedicate your time and resources towards it, whether that's internally, hiring somebody to do that, or outsourcing some of that where you're doing compliance as a service. You bring in somebody like myself where I act as a CIO or CTO to help drive the program forward if you don't have the resources to do that internally. But it's super critical and important to understand that you're establishing a security program, and it's something that needs to be maintained and built upon and fostered, because certainly if you don't dedicate those times and resources to it, it just won't get done. And if it doesn't get done, CMMC will come into play. You'll start seeing these requirements. You're not going to be certified, and you just won't be awarded the contracts. And so it's important for sure.
Very much so.
So I think that kind of covers all of the topics that we wanted to go through. So I think with that, we will we'll end this webinar. Appreciate everyone's time. Thank you for watching.
Thank you.